All right, y'all. If this is the third or fourth or fifth video that you have binged in a row, I'm about to call you out. Today, we're going to talk about why most memoir advice doesn't help, and in fact, why so much of it can actually hurt your progress. Stay tuned. Most memoirs don't stall because of lack of time. Most memoirs stall because of lack of clarity. And that's why I put together the Memoir Method Checklist. The idea here is to give you every single step in the process, not because that makes it easy, of course not, but because no project is ever completed until you know what the steps in the process actually are. You can download it free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. As I mentioned in the intro to this video, I have seen so many cases when over-learning actually doesn't help a memoir at all, and in fact hurts it. But before we dive into that today, I do want to make a quick clarification because y'all know me. I'm never just going to give you the simple answer because I know if you watch this channel, you probably like a little bit of the psychology, a little bit of the inner workings behind how these kinds of things work. And I want to make sure that we get to that. I often find that especially for the core audience of this podcast, YouTube channel, and blog, giving that extra deep dive that helps you really reflect on who you are, how these things impact both you personally and your project can actually be more helpful than the advice itself. So first, I want to start by saying that I am not saying in this video that learning things from YouTube or wherever you're getting your information is bad. Certainly not. And in fact, part of the reason that I put out these videos week after week is that I truly believe that the women that I talk to, the women that I work with most, really can do this. You really can write that memoir. There's just often a gap between your vision, your standards, and your skill set. So, how do we solve that? By putting more educational material out there. But the thing that I really want to focus on in this video, the thing I want you to take away, is that the problem with us as high-achieving women, as women who were so good at school, as women who found validation from our grades and our career achievement, there is a really big difference between getting advice and actually implementing that advice. And this is what I want to talk about today. So often I will speak to women who have binged a lot of my videos. Now, very often folks will tell me either that they've watched every video that we have out there, or just as often they will say, I can't remember if you were the one that said that, or if it was that other woman, or maybe it was that one company or that podcast, or I read it in a book. And what this tells me is that y'all are out there gathering all of the advice. Now, the problem is when we're gathering and gathering and gathering and gathering, while we tell ourselves that the reason we're doing that is to make us more effective at the actual writing process, too often this information-seeking part actually holds us back from starting the process at all. Unless you think that very, very basic premise is where I'm coming from, let me add a level of depth to this, because I don't believe that it's only that we are wasting time, whatever that might mean, learning and learning and learning. Rather, I think something deeper is happening here. I think that when we train ourselves to believe that we need to learn more, we need more information, we need our question answered before we can move forward, we actually train ourselves to reject uncertainty. And here is the unfortunate truth. Uncertainty is part of it. Part of the process of writing any book, memoir, fiction, regular nonfiction, part of that process always is stepping forward in the dark. Now that's really scary. And that, to me, is the strongest argument for getting yourself some support, because you're gonna have to go forward with uncertainty. But at least if you can have somebody with you who has seen other people prevail over uncertainty, you have some reassurance that you're going to be okay. And today I wanted to break down some of the ways that I have seen resistance to that kind of support show up, so that if you see this in yourself, what I want to encourage you to do is stop trying to learn everything on your own. You probably know enough. You are probably ready to start taking those awkward, clumsy, lurching baby steps into the dark. If I can support you, that would be great. But if you don't feel like you need support, at least let me push you out of the nest so that you can get started. Now, before we move into the bulk of this video, which is going to be the 4 ways that I see this kind of unhelpful advice situation play out, I do want to give you a pretty hefty caveat, actually. Now, I love a caveat. I have not started a video with a caveat in a while, so I wanted to throw one out there for y'all. And that is that when you are moving forward from this place of learning, but realizing that the learning is actually stalling your actual progress forward, to getting the support that you need to move forward, one thing that I do want to caution you of is that you don't move forward to get support that will just enable that same holding back, that same learning everything before doing kind of habit we're talking about here. And I saw this really, really recently, actually. So I was consulting with a woman who was moving forward with a book that she actually already had an agent for. Now this is, I know y'all are so jealous because this is a dreamy, dreamy situation. But when I talked to her, and this was, by the way, a very highly accomplished woman, a woman who had done amazing things in her career, who had multiple advanced degrees in different fields, etc., etc., etc. One thing that she said to me was, I don't know, maybe I'll just go get an MFA. Now, let me tell you, if you're not familiar with MFAs, that stands for Master of Fine Arts. That is the terminal degree in writing. In fact, my right hand, Emily Thrash, has an MFA, that terminal degree. She has been through all of the training, and many, many of my peers in this space have that same qualification too. But here's the thing about an MFA. An MFA is not a program in which you enroll and then begin writing your book. An MFA is a program in which you enroll and you do write during an MFA, but you are mostly learning to write during the MFA. Once it spits you out at the other end, you still have to write the book. And y'all, you can start now. You do not need an MFA. You do not need to wait 4 years. You do not need anybody's permission. You just have to embrace the fear of actually starting and really practice applying that advice. Okay. So that caveat out of the way, all I want to make sure that y'all hear is that we are trying to move from learning to doing. And the problem is that a lot of support out there will actually not push you forward to do. It will continue to allow you to learn and learn and learn. And there might be a point where you move on from the learning, but it will not happen until you push yourself. So I just don't want us to double down and go from learning on YouTube, learning on podcasts, learning on a blog, into learning in some more formalized scenario where you are still hiding behind needing to learn more rather than stepping forward boldly, bravely, courageously to actually do the thing. All right, that said, let's move into the 4 ways that I see this play out. The first way that I see memoir advice not really being quite as helpful as we might hope is that unfortunately most of that advice is much, much too vague and broad. Now, this is particularly true of free advice that you would find on YouTube, podcasts, free downloads, blogs, that kind of thing. But this applies to all kinds of spaces. And I want to break it down in 2 different ways. So the first way that the advice being kind of generic, broad, unspecific can really hurt, especially when we're talking memoir, is that, as you will no doubt know if you found me by searching around to all the different options of free advice channels, most writing advice is for fiction authors. Now, this is kind of an interesting dynamic, I think, because when we talk about memoir, we are talking about a genre that blends components of fiction with components and philosophy of nonfiction. So there is nothing to say, actually, that fiction advice can't be helpful to memoirists. In fact, it is so helpful that Emily, my right hand, has an MFA in fiction, and that is a big part of why I brought her on to direct the program. But of course, whenever we're digging into advice for our memoir, fiction advice is never going to get us all the way there. For one thing, y'all, fiction authors have endless choices of how to have the plot play out. If you're writing a memoir, You don't have endless choices. It happened the way it happened. So fiction advice can be really, really limited. And as an extension of that, we're talking mostly about the writing process here. But I do want to let you know, beware of getting advice from fiction advice sources about publishing. The processes for querying publishing fiction are hugely different than the processes for querying and publishing nonfiction. So the first kind of way that I see this playing out is that when we're looking for advice, especially free advice, it is most often going to be for fiction writers or sometimes for business book writers. It will very rarely be specifically dialed into memoir, just because that's a pretty small slice of the market. Most companies out there are really trying to cast a much broader net. They're trying to get people to work with them who are writing every type of book. So that's the first way. But there's a second way that I think is maybe even more important to keep in mind, and that is that even if advice is good memoir advice, it doesn't mean it's good memoir advice for your memoir. And one of the things that came to mind as I was kind of thinking about these 4 ways that we were going to talk about today was kind of an example that is really more of a pattern. Now, y'all know I talk about it all the time. We have a very small, intimate, curated group of women that we work with in the Memoir method. I call it our group program. We call it our group program. And this is a place where women come together and they get training. We certainly have training. In fact, the development section, which is kind of our trademark, kind of our signature piece, is step by step by step. It is made to be so easy to learn and digest the information. And that is all there on demand. But part of our group program is that we also meet as a group once a week, and we offer you a free weekly check-in with Emily that is a direct connection, a direct place to ask your questions. And there is a very specific reason that we have these extra places that you can check in, not just more videos to watch, not just more worksheets, not just more stuff to read. And the reason is, memoir advice is memoir advice. That doesn't mean it applies to your memoir. And I bet that you have felt this before because I see it all the time in our group program. I see it in one-on-one. I even see it in our ghostwriting clients. Oftentimes, folks will come in having heard or read or something about memoir, and they will wonder, does this apply to my book? But you know what it never sounds like? It never sounds like, how do I apply this to my book? It sounds like, am I doing my book wrong? And this is why it is so important that you both get the advice 100%, learn the information, yes, do it, and that you have someone to talk to about it in your specific memoir situation. All of our books are as unique as us. That's one of the very special parts, I think, about memoir as a genre, is that every single book is different because every single person's experience is different and every single person's interpretation of that experience is different. That's a beautiful thing, but it means that generic advice very often will not work, or it will lead you astray, or it will just simply put your focus in the wrong place. So, to kind of recap this, the first way that I see memoir advice failing people is that it is either too broad and generic in terms of writing advice, or more dialed in, it might be okay for memoir, but it's much more difficult to think about how to apply memoir advice to your specific memoir than it is to continue to read more and more and more and more memoir advice. So that's the first thing. We tend to be a little bit too broad, too generic when we're finding advice online. And always, 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 the best advice is what works when rubber meets the road. This is, again, why it's so helpful to have a professional in your corner. A professional can tell you, oh yes, I know about that advice, but here is why it won't work for your book. Or, yep, that is great advice. Here's how I would implement. Without that professional, very often we will just continue to seek that same kind of validation. We will continue to ask the ether if you're doing the wrong thing on your book by continuing to learn, continuing to consume content without actually putting it into practice. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, I teased this earlier, Learning is not the same thing as doing. Now, there are a number of different ways that pedagogical theory tells us how to move forward with actually teaching. Now, one advantage that I have within my particular business is that both Emily and I have over a decade, I haven't counted up in a while, of actual teaching experience. So Emily and I have both taught, both at the secondary level and the university level. Both of us have been in that actual classroom space, seeing how teaching works with application. And as part of that, we know that there are a few different models that can be useful for this type of learning. The first is that we move very slowly from learning the information into guided implementation and into self-implementation. Now, you probably experienced this, maybe even before, as I did, before it was an actual pedagogical theory. But if we think about when we're very first learning to do math, for instance, usually what it looks like is the teacher up at the front. It was a blackboard when I was in school. I think they're all whiteboards or smartboards now. And the teacher is doing a problem up on the board. You watch them do that problem. They explain the steps of the process. They explain to you how they got to the answer that they got to. Then, in that classroom, you would complete some problems. The teacher might be walking around. They're available for questions. They're looking at your work as you go and letting you know where you're right and where you're wrong. And then you have homework. You take a sheet of problems home. You complete those problems on your own and bring them back to assess how much you learned. So in that way, the teacher is doing it, then you are doing it with the teacher, then you are doing it on your own. That's a really great conventional model, but I don't find that it is as successful as the secondary type of model, which is a flipped classroom model. Now, in this model, you actually do have time to process the information that you are learning because you are learning it independently of the teacher. So in that math example, that teacher's standing up there doing the formula, doing your math problem. In a flipped classroom model, you might get a video of the teacher doing the model. You might get a written instruction. You might get some diagrams or illustrations. You can get a lot of different things. And in fact, we know that this is really, really beneficial for learners because it allows us to target all different types of learning styles. It allows the learner to sit with the information, to choose how they want to process it, and really bring it inside of their body and mind. Now, in a flipped classroom, we do still have guided implementation, the same way we do when you were doing the problem in the classroom and the teacher was wandering around. But here, whereas we had the teacher right there where you were applying it, with the flipped classroom, you get to play around, experiment. You have as much time as you'd like to with that learning point. But the point of a flipped classroom is for you to come in and practice doing that work. Now, I've been talking this kind of simplified math model, but I want to break out of that for a second and talk about something that is a little bit more of an advanced skill. Because, of course, while basic math can be challenging to learn, it also is pretty straightforward. You don't have the nuance and complexity and really complex decision making that you do in a full-length book project. So when we pull back here at the point of applying the information, what often happens is that the way writing is taught is much less guided. There's a good reason for that. In that traditional model, there isn't really a good way for you to watch a teacher live writing a chapter or even an outline, certainly not a full book. But what that means is that the learning in this type of work is very often conceptual. It's theoretical. So while in that traditional model, the teacher was showing you a math problem, that's not theoretical or philosophical. That's just step-by-step how to do it. What often happens when we're talking about this model for writing is the thing that we are learning by watching the teacher do it is all the theory and all the philosophy. Well, what happens then when you have to do guided application? Well, typically it's not that guided. Typically you get all the theory, you get all the philosophy, and then you go home on your own to figure out how to apply it. Now, if you have done this, and I suspect you have, it's hugely frustrating. You've got this very general, very theoretical, very abstract concept, but the words on the page aren't abstract. They aren't vague. You have to pick actual words. And this is where the flipped classroom model absolutely sings its chef's kiss. Because when we are doing a flipped classroom model, we cut out that supervised application stage, and instead we pull this into 2 stages. So the first stage is your learning, but since you're not sitting in a classroom, since there's no pressure for things to be done on a classroom timeline, you can actually play with it however you want. You get that information, you sit at the computer, you test it out, and then you bring that experience into our third step, which is feedback. So in some ways, we actually have flipped where the guided instruction is, and I have found in my time in the classroom, so has Emily, that this is a far superior way to teach any kind of nuanced skill. If we can try it first with accountability, with someone to make sure we actually try it, then we can bring that information in, get feedback on our attempt, and try again. This is life-changing. When we move from the learn, do with observation, do on our own, to a learn, try, ask, we are so much more emboldened not to learn and then do, but to learn as we do. And spoiler alert, this is the reason that we have set up our group program the way we have, because we don't want you to learn to write a memoir and then write a memoir. We want you to write the memoir, and in that process, you're gonna learn how to do it. We want you to have the right information at your fingertips at the time you need it. So of course, the development section, for instance, is step by step. You always know what you should be doing at that time. And as you move through, we want you trying it. In fact, we will ask you directly twice a week whether you are actually trying it, and everybody in the group is. It's kind of amazing how it works. We have so many opportunities for learning and not doing. And when we are finally in an environment that encourages us to learn while we do, well, wouldn't you know, everything changes. Okay, so the second reason, the second way I see this pop up is just the confusion over learning and doing. Have I learned enough? Am I ready to move forward? My answer is always going to be, you have learned enough to get started, but you probably haven't learned enough to finish, and that's okay. It works way, way better to learn and do at the same time than it does to learn first and do later. Okay, the third reason that I see memoir advice coming up, not only to not help, actually hurt people's memoir, is that because the learning takes time, because it is intellectually active, because it can be kind of challenging actually, even when you're talking, reading a blog post, listening to a podcast episode, it takes time. And that so often tricks us into thinking we are being productive. Now, it would be so easy to kill hours on the weekend listening to advice. And the way that I know that is not from writing advice, but rather for business advice. But I wanted to pull it in because I think it's helpful here. Now, when I first started my business, I had no idea what I was doing. No idea. I had been an academic before that. I had run a theater before that. I had been an actor. I had no idea how a person laid out a business plan, executed it. No idea. So do you know what I did? I listened to so many podcasts. And while many of those were helpful, most of them just made me feel bad about myself. I binged and I didn't believe that I could do it. So I just kept binging and I just kept binging. And wouldn't you know, all of that time spent binging, it taught me some stuff, but it didn't get me any further in the direction I wanted to go. Now, I do want to make a caveat here, because while there is a point at which you are wasting time by listening to too much free advice, there also is something to be said for not all of your memoir productivity has to look like words on a page. And I just want to make sure I'm really clear here, because this is an important distinction. Sometimes folks will think if they are not actively typing words into their manuscript, they are not actually making progress. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. So I do want you to distinguish here between this kind of binging on content, this kind of learning instead of doing, versus the actual application that looks different from putting words on the page. So what might this second type look like? Well, sometimes it looks like hearing a theoretical idea and kind of ruminating on it a little bit, thinking a little bit about how it might apply, maybe brainstorming some ways that you might take this piece of advice, implement it into your book. Sometimes it looks like pausing a little bit because you heard something that made you just think a little bit different, even about your experience, about the story of the book. And in that case, it can be super helpful to just take some time and sit with those ideas. Again, you might kind of do a brain dump, you might journal. Those things can be productive when we are thinking about how exactly we want to apply and actively applying that information. It can be useful, but we want to make really, really sure that we are actually moving out of the learning and into the actual application, because if we're not doing that, it really is not going to serve us. Okay, and then the final piece of this puzzle, the final way that I see memoir advice actively harming people's memoir, is that when we consume so much advice, so much of it, I understand, being very black and white, feeling very much do or die, one of the things that we often are subconsciously doing to ourselves is raising our expectations of our own performance. Now, this is a problem. If you are trying to compete in, say, 50-yard dash, you would have a few options about how you approached it, right? On one hand, you could spend your time reading about the mechanics of the body. You could think about what kinds of foods you want to eat to fuel your performance. You could think about the proper rest routines. You could think about the proper training schedule, all of those things. Or you could be looking into those pieces of advice as you started running. And guess which person's going to do better? The thing that happens is when we learn and we learn and we learn, but we don't do, is that we don't develop any muscle memory for how we would actually implement those things. And what it means is when we finally start to apply that advice, it is going to feel like we are so clunky. It is going to be so impossibly difficult, because now we feel like we really ought to know what we're doing. We've sure spent a lot of time learning it. Why don't we know? Well, instead, if we do the second way, if we learn as we do, then we are continually building up muscle memory. That helps in two ways. The first way is, once your muscles are ready to move, you are so much more nimble at implementing new advice. We've done this before, right? We know that we can implement advice. We know we can think about some of these ideas and actually work them into our book because we've been doing it. So the first way is we are so much more able to actually apply things. It feels easier, it goes faster. But the second way is when we have been actively practicing at incorporating feedback into our memoir, we also increase our discernment. And that means that sometimes we hear advice and say, that is not for me. To carry my business example a little bit further, when I very first started binging podcasts about business, I wasn't implementing any of it. And in fact, it just made me feel like I should be ready once I started. I thought I understood everything there was to understand. Now, when I listen to business podcasts, I very often just skip the episode altogether if I can tell it doesn't have anything to do with me or my business. If you haven't started applying information on how to write your memoir yet, you will not know what advice is good and which advice is not for you. But the more you actually put rubber to the road, the more you will be able to see not only which advice matters, but also how to apply that. You will have such a better sense of your own confidence, your own ability, your own growing, developing skill than if you just keep learning. Okay, I hope that this has been helpful. And let me say, if you are somebody who recognized yourself in either or all of these habits, I want to invite you to join us in the Memoir Method. Now, as I mentioned, this is a highly curated, highly selective group of women, but the thing that we're looking for is not that you've learned everything on the internet. The thing that we're looking for is that you are willing to start applying, that you are ready to get going, even though it's not going to be perfect, even though it's going to be pretty hard, even though you are going to have to revise. There's no escaping it. What we are looking for is that you are coachable and ready. If that's you, I hope you'll reach out. You can schedule a call directly with me at pageandpodium.com/contact. Now that call is meant to be helpful for you in the moment. Even if we find that the group program isn't right for you, I always try to make sure that I'm sending every single person away with one piece of actionable advice. So if you have been on the fence about this because you're afraid I'm just going to try to sell you something, truly that is not what we do on these calls. I just want to get to know you, want to hear about your book, and I really want to see if we could help you. It is my mission, the mission of my entire team, to get more stories out, to make sure that some of these experiences that have not been talked about the way that they should be, for whatever gatekeepy kind of reasons, actually see the light of day. And that's what I want for you too. I want you to stop listening to my YouTube channel, stop listening to my podcast, stop reading my blog until you have put some of those ideas into practice. And I can tell you from experience, it's going to feel so much better to do that when you have someone watching over you who cares about your book, who understands what you're trying to do, who wants to hear the specific challenges, the specific nuanced complexity of your story, of your vision, your message, your idea for your book. It's going to be so much easier. So I hope you'll reach out. Give me a chance to chat with you a little bit. Let me hear your book idea, let you know whether it really has legs, and then let's decide if it is time for you to stop learning from freebie information and get your butt into a place where we can actually move that book forward. I hope that time comes soon, but until then, happy writing. Most memoirs don't fail for lack of time. They fail for lack of clarity, because their author is trying to move forward in a process that is unfamiliar and unclear with no one to support their efforts. And that's why I put together something very practical, the Memoir Method Checklist. This is designed to give you every single step in the process so you not only know what you need to work on now, you know what's coming next, and after that, until you have that beautiful published book in your hands. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.